The meaning of the idiom "the bee's knees" is weird. Why should the bee's knees refer to something excellent? But this is what makes the idiom "the bee's knees" interesting, as the idiom may serve as a good lesson into how we can develop certain expectations regarding idioms and have those expectations defied, causing us to become creative and in the end create what are popularly called folk etymologies. So stay tuned while I go over the meaning again, and then we can talk about the origin of this idiom. Meaning of the English idiom, the bee's knees. Something that is the bee's knees is excellent, of high quality, desirable, enjoyable, or extremely good. Examples of use. That Essential English Idioms channel is the bee's knees. This new place in town has the best doner sandwiches. It's really the bee's knees. So now we can talk about the curious and perhaps unexpected origin of the bee's knees. You have to wonder how the bee's knees came to mean something very good. Do bees even have knees? And what's so great about them? Well, the original meaning of this idiom made more sense. Bee's knees simply refer to something small, something of a diminutive nature, easy. Then it later somehow changed to mean something of excellent quality, something great. I say somehow because I do not know exactly how this change took place. I can only speculate. But there are some interesting theories. Consider animal idioms in general. Many of them tend to draw on our common knowledge of the animal, whether biological or just stereotypical. For example, the idiom "snake in the grass" is transparent and easy to understand. A snake hiding in the grass is something to be wary of. Indeed, it may be poisonous. So the meaning of snake in the grass, a deceitful, treacherous, and sneaky person, makes perfect sense. And many of us perceive bats as being blind, or we know that they have very weak eyesight. So the idiom "blind as a bat" needs little explanation. Now look at another familiar bee idiom, "busy as a bee." We understand bees to be busy creatures, always working in the hive or buzzing around collecting nectar or pollen. We see them as industrious and on the move. So the idiom "busy as a bee" is about as transparent as an idiom can be. It's quite compositional, meaning you can deduce the meaning from the words used. The bee's knees does not follow this pattern. Its meaning is not apparent from the words that are used. You'd be forgiven in thinking the bee's knees means something impossible, since bees do not have knees. At least I don't think they do. I'm not an entomologist or an expert on bees. So even if we imagine bees do have knees, maybe the bee's knees mean something very small, as the knee of a bee would have to be extremely tiny. And as I said, this was the original meaning. Then it changed to become something very good. How do we deal with this? Well, some, expecting the idiom to follow the same pattern as those other familiar idioms, have relied on a colorful story. Only this time it involves uncommon knowledge about bees. Bees collect pollen from flowers and they load it onto tiny patches of hair on their legs. These are called scopa. And again, I'm not an expert, so if I'm getting anything wrong about bees, it's entirely my fault. Anyway, the hair holds onto the pollen so it can be flown back to the hive. So maybe we can see these scopa as analogous to knees. This pollen stored on the bee's knees is flown back to the hive to make honey. And honey is something of the highest quality, perhaps precious and sought after. But pollen isn't used to make honey. Nectar is. But I guess honey could end up having pollen in it. I don't really know. Regardless, since pollen isn't really used to make honey, the theory evolves. So I think the pollen is primarily used to feed larvae. But anyway, the pollen is incidentally transferred from flower to flower by the bees, helping the flowers to reproduce. And this is why bees are so important. And aren't flowers precious? So the bee's knees refers to something precious or excellent, the best. As you may be understanding, we have twisted ourselves into a linguistic pretzel to try to make this idiom fit our expectations. It's an etymological quagmire, and what's more, it can never be proven or disproven. And it relies on the idea that the pollen-collecting apparatus on a bee's legs is commonly understood enough to give birth to an idiom. Boy. Now, folk etymology is a technical linguistic term that means something very specific, but in layman's terms, we think of it as something that's just made up by the folk, right? So this is why such a theory is called folk etymology. The theory is made to fit the circumstances, to make the idiom fit a mold. Idioms are stubborn. They do not always cooperate. Now try to come up with such a theory for a similar idiom, the cat's pajamas. While colorful stories satisfy our need for sensible and interesting origins, it's more likely that the bee's knees changed its meaning because of the existence of idioms like the cat's pajamas. So it was still about expectations, but these expectations played a quite different role. Here are some other similar idioms. The dog's bullocks, the spider's ankles, that's an Irish one, the ant's pants, the fox's socks, notice all the rhyming, and the camel's hump. Many of these idioms are contemporary to each other. They all came about and were used during a similar time period. In other words, it is likely that the existence of these other animal idioms to mean something very good caused the bee's knees to be used this way also, and this change to the opposite meaning happened very quickly. People simply expected the idiom to mean something excellent. Bee's knees to mean something small was used during the mid to late 1800s. It's often referred to someone's height being no higher than a bee's knees, similar to how we say down south, knee-high to a grasshopper. By the early 1900s, its present meaning was already common.